The sun hung low over Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, painting the desert sky in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. It was the spring of 1882, and the town sat at the edge of civilization, where the law was as fragile as a tumbleweed rolling across the dusty Main Street. Deputy Marshal James "Jim" Holloway stood on the weathered porch of the sheriff's office, his badge catching the dying light. At 32 years old, he was a tall man with shoulders broadened by years of hard work and harder choices. His dark hair showed hints of premature gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held the kind of steady gaze that made men think twice before drawing their weapons. Jim had seen his share of violence. He'd ridden with a posse that tracked the notorious Blackwell gang across 3 territories. He'd stood toe-to-toe with cattle rustlers, bank robbers, and claim jumpers. But nothing in his years of wearing a badge had prepared him for what would happen when Catherine Mercer came to town. The stagecoach rumbled down Main Street, its wheels churning up clouds of New Mexico dust that settled on everything like a fine, gritty blanket. Jim watched it roll to a stop in front of the Grand Hotel, a 2-story structure that was the finest building Redemption Creek had to offer, which wasn't saying much. The paint was peeling and the sign swung on rusty hinges, creaking in the dry wind. When the door of the stagecoach opened, Jim's attention sharpened. A woman stepped down, and even from 50 yards away, he could see she was different from the typical frontier women who passed through town. She wore a black dress that marked her as a widow, but the fabric was fine quality, not the rough homespun most settlers wore. A veil covered her face, but he could make out pale skin and a delicate jaw. Behind her, the driver handed down a small trunk and a leather satchel. She took them with a quiet nod, paid the man, and walked into the hotel with the kind of dignity that seemed out of place in this rough-and-tumble corner of the world. "Who's that?" asked Billy Cooper, the young deputy who'd been assigned to Jim 6 months earlier. Billy was 19, eager, and still had the look of someone who thought being a lawman was all about adventure and glory. Jim had been slowly teaching him otherwise. "Don't know," Jim replied, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "But she's running from something. People don't come to Redemption Creek unless they're running toward opportunity or away from trouble." Billy scratched his sunburned nose. "How can you tell she's running?" Jim struck a match on his boot heel and lit his cigarette. "Because opportunity doesn't wear widow's weeds and arrive on the evening stage with just one trunk. That's a woman traveling light, keeping mobile. My guess is she wants to disappear for a while." What Jim didn't say, what he couldn't quite explain even to himself, was that something about her had caught his attention in a way that had nothing to do with law enforcement. There was something in the way she'd moved, a kind of sad grace that stirred something in his chest he'd thought long buried. That evening, Jim sat in the saloon nursing a whiskey. The silver dollar wasn't much to look at, but it served its purpose. The bartender, a grizzled former prospector named Dutch, kept the whiskey flowing and knew when to mind his own business. The sawdust on the floor soaked up spilled drinks and blood with equal efficiency. "Heard we got a new arrival," Dutch said, wiping down the bar with a rag that had seen better days. Lady in black checked into the Grand. Jim took a sip of his whiskey. "Word travels fast. Mrs. Patterson at the hotel says her name's Catherine Mercer. Says she's from Kansas looking to start fresh." Dutch leaned in conspiratorially. "Also says the lady's got money. Paid for a week in advance, cash money." The name meant nothing to Jim, but the details did. A widow with cash money traveling alone, that painted a picture. In 1882, women didn't typically travel the frontier alone unless circumstances forced them to. Most came west with family or to meet family. The ones who came alone were either very brave, very desperate, or both. "She mentioned what brought her to Redemption Creek?" Jim asked. Dutch shook his head. "Kept to herself. Polite but not friendly, if you know what I mean." Jim knew exactly what he meant. He'd seen it before, people trying to blend into the background, not drawing attention, not making connections. It was the behavior of someone who didn't want to be remembered, didn't want to be found. The saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Tom Garrett walked in. He was in his 50s, with a gray mustache and a belly that had been growing steadily since he'd given up chasing outlaws personally and started leaving the dangerous work to his deputies. He was a good man, though honest and fair, which was more than could be said for many frontier lawmen. "Jim, got a telegram you need to see," Sheriff Garrett said, his face serious. They moved to a corner table, away from the handful of cowhands playing poker and the prospector muttering to himself at the bar. Garrett unfolded the telegram and smoothed it on the table. Jim read it twice, his jaw tightening with each word. The telegram was from Marshal Henry Collins in Dodge City, Kansas. It was brief and to the point, the way telegrams always were when every word cost money. "Stop. Catherine Mercer may be headed your way. Stop. Widow of Jake Mercer aka Jake the Blade. Stop. Husband killed in shootout 2 months ago. Stop. Woman not wanted but caution advised. Stop. Mercers robbed banks across Kansas and Nebraska. Stop. Brother Lucas Mercer still at large and dangerous. Stop. Jim felt his stomach drop. Jake the Blade. He'd heard of him. Every lawman west of the Mississippi had heard of Jake Mercer. The man had been one of the most notorious outlaws in the territories, not as famous as Jesse James or Billy the Kid, but dangerous enough. He'd specialized in bank robberies, always carrying a Bowie knife that he'd supposedly used to kill 3 men in close combat. The newspapers had loved him for a while, printing sensational stories about his crimes. You thinking what I'm thinking? Sheriff Garrett asked. Jim nodded slowly. That the widow of one of the deadliest outlaws in Kansas just checked into our hotel, and we need to find out why. Could be she's just trying to escape her husband's reputation, Garrett suggested. Can't be easy being married to a man like that. Maybe now that he's dead, she wants a fresh start. Maybe, Jim agreed. But his lawman's instincts were telling him there was more to the story. There always was. But that telegram mentioned a brother. Lucas Mercer. If he's still riding the outlaw trail, he might come looking for her. Garrett stroked his mustache, a habit he had when thinking. Or she might be meeting him here. Could be planning another job. It was a possibility Jim couldn't ignore. Redemption Creek had a bank, small, but it held the money from the local cattle ranches and the mines in the nearby hills. It would be a tempting target for an outlaw gang. I'll keep an eye on her, Jim said. See what she's up to. Garrett clapped him on the shoulder. Be careful, Jim. Woman's got a pretty face from what I hear. Don't let that cloud your judgment. Jim bristled slightly at the suggestion but knew Garrett meant well. I'm not some green kid. I can handle this. But as he walked back to his small room behind the sheriff's office that night, Jim couldn't help but think about the woman in black. Catherine Mercer. The outlaw's widow. He wondered what kind of woman married a man like Jake the Blade. He wondered what kind of life she'd led, what she'd seen, what choices she'd made. And he wondered why, despite everything his training and experience told him about staying detached and professional, he found himself wanting to know her story. Jim's opportunity came the next morning. He was making his rounds, checking in with the merchants on Main Street, when he saw Catherine Mercer leaving the general store. In the bright morning light, without her veil, he got his first clear look at her. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. But it wasn't the kind of beauty that hit you like a fist. It was quieter, more refined. She had auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, pale skin that spoke of life lived indoors or in the shade, and dark eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sadness. She couldn't have been more than 28 or 29, but there was something in her expression that made her seem older, wearier. She carried a basket with supplies, flour, sugar, some canned goods. She was setting up to stay for a while, not just passing through. "Morning, ma'am," Jim said, tipping his hat as he approached. "I'm Deputy Marshal Jim Holloway. Welcome to Redemption Creek." She stopped, and for just a moment, Jim saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear? Wariness? Before her expression smoothed into polite neutrality. "Good morning, Deputy," she said. Her voice was soft but clear, with the educated accent of someone who'd had schooling. "Catherine Mercer. I appreciate the welcome. Not many strangers come through town," Jim said, trying to keep his tone casual and friendly. "Especially not ladies traveling alone. If you don't mind my asking, what brings you to Redemption Creek?" Catherine shifted her basket to her other arm. "I'm looking for peace and quiet, Deputy. I've recently lost my husband, and I need time to find my way forward." It was a reasonable answer and delivered with just the right amount of sadness. But Jim had interrogated enough people to notice the slight hesitation before she mentioned her husband, the way her fingers tightened on the basket handle. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jim said, and meant it. Whatever else Jake Mercer had been, he'd been her husband. "If there's anything the sheriff's office can do to make your stay more comfortable, you just let us know." "That's kind of you." She offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure I'll be fine. I'm planning to rent a small house, perhaps find some work. I'm a seamstress by trade." A seamstress. That explained her fine clothes, the careful stitching he could see in her dress. It also gave her a plausible reason to settle in town. Redemption Creek could always use a good seamstress. "Mrs. Patterson at the general store might know of some available properties," Jim offered. "And she could probably spread the word about your services." "Thank you, Deputy. I've already spoken with her." Catherine adjusted her basket again. "If you'll excuse me, I should get these supplies back to my room." "Of course." "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Mrs. Mercer." He watched her walk away, noting the straight line of her back, the careful, measured pace of her steps. Everything about her seemed controlled, deliberate. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned to be careful, to not draw attention. What kind of marriage had she had with Jake the Blade? Had she known about his crimes? Had she helped him plan robberies, or had she been kept in the dark, an innocent wife married to a monster? Jim found himself wanting to believe the latter, even though his experience told him that most outlaws' wives knew exactly what their husbands did. They had to. It was impossible to hide that kind of life from someone you shared a bed with. Over the next few days, Jim watched Catherine Mercer settle into Redemption Creek. True to her word, she rented a small adobe house on the edge of town. One room with a kitchen and a sleeping loft, modest but clean. She set up her sewing supplies in the front window where the light was good, and word spread quickly that there was a skilled seamstress in town. The women of Redemption Creek, starved for quality needlework, began to visit. Jim heard about it from Mrs. Patterson, who stopped by the sheriff's office to report on the town's new arrival. "She's very talented," Mrs. Patterson said, her ample frame filling the doorway. "Fixed the hem on my Sunday dress better than I could have done myself. And her prices are fair, not trying to gouge us just because there's no other seamstress for 50 miles. "That's good to hear," Jim said, not looking up from the paperwork on his desk. Reports that needed to be filed, warrants that needed to be reviewed. Mrs. Patterson wasn't deterred by his apparent disinterest. She was a woman who loved to talk, and she'd clearly decided that Jim needed to hear about Catherine Mercer. "She's very quiet though. Polite, but doesn't say much about herself. Some of the ladies have been asking questions, you know how it is, but she keeps her answers short. Says she's from Kansas, that her husband died and she wanted a fresh start. That's about all anyone's gotten out of her." Jim set down his pen. "People are entitled to their privacy, Mrs. Patterson." "Oh, I agree," the older woman said quickly. "But you know how people talk. There's been some speculation. A young widow traveling alone, settling in a frontier town. Some folks are wondering if she's running from something." "Maybe she's running to something," Jim suggested. "Maybe she's trying to build a new life." Mrs. Patterson studied him with shrewd eyes. "You've taken an interest in her, haven't you, Jim?" "I take an interest in everyone who comes to town," Jim said firmly. "It's my job." But he knew it was more than that. He'd found himself walking past Catherine's house more often than necessary during his patrols. He'd noticed the lamp burning late into the night as she worked on her sewing. He'd seen her at the general store, always polite, always reserved, always alone. The truth was, Catherine Mercer intrigued him. Not just because of her connection to Jake the Blade, but because of the contradictions he saw in her. She was clearly educated and refined, yet she'd married an outlaw. She kept to herself, yet she'd chosen to settle in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. She seemed sad and weary, yet there was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a determination in the way she went about building her new life. Jim wanted to know her story. He wanted to understand what had shaped her, what had brought her to this point. And yes, if he was honest with himself, he was attracted to her. There was something about her that drew him in, made him want to protect her, to ease the sadness he saw in her eyes. But he was a lawman and she was the widow of an outlaw. That complicated everything. 3 weeks after Catherine's arrival, the trouble Jim had been half expecting finally came knocking. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered by the weekly mail coach. Jim was at the post office picking up wanted posters when the postmaster, a nervous little man named Elijah Sykes, pulled him aside. "Jim, got something here you should see," Elijah said in a low voice. He handed over a letter addressed to Catherine Mercer. "This came in on today's coach. It's from Nebraska." Jim took the letter, noting the return address, or rather, the lack of one. The handwriting was rough, the kind of scrawl you'd expect from someone with little education. The postmark showed it had been mailed from North Platte, a rough railroad town known for attracting drifters, cowboys, and outlaws. "Why are you showing me this?" Jim asked, though he had a pretty good idea. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's just, folks have been talking. About Mrs. Mercer and her husband. Word got around about who he was. And now she's getting mail from Nebraska, which is where the Mercer gang used to operate, and I just thought, well, I thought you should know." Jim felt a flash of anger at the violation of Catherine's privacy, but he understood Elijah's concern. In frontier towns, survival often depended on everyone looking out for potential trouble. If Catherine was in contact with outlaws, it could bring danger to the entire community. "I'll deliver this to her," Jim said. "And Elijah? Keep this between us." No need to add more fuel to the gossip fire. Elijah nodded quickly. Of course. I wouldn't want to spread rumors. Jim knew that was probably a lie. Elijah would tell his wife and she'd tell her friends, and by tomorrow half the town would know Catherine had received a letter from Nebraska. But maybe Jim could get ahead of it, find out what was going on before speculation turned into panic. He found Catherine at home, sitting by her window with a dress spread across her lap, her needle flashing in the afternoon light. When she answered his knock, she looked surprised to see him. "Deputy Holloway. Is something wrong?" "Letter for you," Jim said, holding it out. "Came in on today's mail coach." She took it and Jim watched her face carefully. He saw recognition in her eyes, followed by something that looked like dread. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the envelope. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Is there anything else?" Jim knew he should leave. He had no right to pry into her personal correspondence. But his instincts were screaming that this letter was important, potentially dangerous. "Mrs. Mercer. Catherine, if you're in some kind of trouble, I can help. That's what I do." For a long moment she just looked at him. Jim could see her weighing her options, deciding how much to trust him. Finally she stepped back from the door. "Would you like to come in, Deputy?" The inside of Catherine's house was simple but clean. She'd added small touches that made it feel like a home. A colorful blanket draped over the back of a chair, wildflowers in a jar on the table, her sewing supplies organized neatly on shelves she'd built or bought. It was the home of someone who intended to stay, who was building a life. Catherine gestured to a chair at the small table and took the seat opposite him. She set the letter down between them, unopened. "That's from my brother-in-law," she said without preamble. "Lucas Mercer." Jim felt his pulse quicken but kept his expression neutral. "Jake the Blade's brother." Catherine's eyes widened slightly. "You know who my husband was. Got a telegram from the marshal in Dodge City the day after you arrived. He thought we should know." She looked down at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I should have known I couldn't outrun the past. I should have changed my name, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like erasing Jake completely, and despite everything I couldn't do that to his memory." "Tell me about him," Jim said gently. "About Jake." Catherine was quiet for so long that Jim thought she might not answer. But then she began to speak, her voice soft but steady. "I met Jake when I was 18 years old. He came into my father's store in Leavenworth, Kansas. He was handsome and charming, and he made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. My father didn't approve, said there was something wild about Jake, something dangerous. But I was young and foolish, and I thought love could conquer anything." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the unopened letter. "We were married 6 months later. For the first year, everything was wonderful. Jake worked at the stockyards and I took in sewing. We had a small house and I thought we were happy. Then Jake's brother Lucas came to stay with us and everything changed." Jim leaned forward slightly. "Lucas got Jake involved in outlawry?" "Lucas was already riding with a gang. They'd robbed a train in Missouri and needed a place to hide. Jake let them stay with us and I knew it was wrong, but what could I do? They were family. And Jake assured me it was just for a few weeks until things cooled down." Catherine's voice grew harder, tinged with old anger and regret. "But Lucas kept talking to Jake, telling him stories about the money they'd made, the excitement, the adventure, making an honest life sound boring and small. Jake started to change. He became restless, dissatisfied with our quiet life. And then one day he came home and told me he'd quit his job. Said he and Lucas were going into business together." "Bank robbery," Jim said quietly. Catherine nodded. "I didn't want to believe it at first. But then Jake started coming home with money, more money than he could have made honestly. He bought me nice dresses, jewelry. He wanted to give me the world, he said. But all I wanted was for him to be safe, to be legal, to be the man I'd married. Did you try to stop him?" "Of course I did." Catherine's eyes flashed with emotion. "I begged him to stop, to think about our future. But he said he couldn't back out now, that Lucas and the gang depended on him. And I think part of him loved it. The danger, the thrill. He was addicted to it." She took a shaky breath. "For 8 years I lived like that. Never knowing if he'd come home, if he'd be arrested, if he'd be killed. I moved from town to town, using different names, always looking over my shoulder. Jake would disappear for weeks at a time, then show up with money and stories. He was good to me in his way. He never raised a hand to me, never hurt me. But he broke my heart a little more every day." "How did he die?" Jim asked, though he knew the basics from the telegram. "There was a bank robbery in Hayes City. Something went wrong. I never got the full story. The law was waiting for them. Jake and another man were killed. Lucas and the others escaped. Lucas sent me a telegram telling me Jake was dead, and that I should disappear before the law came looking for me as an accomplice. Catherine's eyes met Jim's and he saw the truth there, the pain and honesty. I never helped them, deputy. I never planned robberies or scouted banks or did any of the things outlaws' wives sometimes do. I just lived with the consequences of loving the wrong man. And when Jake died, I took what money we had saved, money I'd earned with my sewing, not robbery money, and I came here to start over. To be just Catherine, not Jake the Blade's wife. Not an outlaw's widow. Just me. Jim believed her. Maybe he was a fool, maybe he was letting her beauty and sadness cloud his judgment, but he believed every word she'd said. He'd interviewed enough liars to know the difference between truth and fiction, and Catherine Mercer was telling the truth. What about Lucas? Jim asked, nodding toward the unopened letter. What does he want? Catherine picked up the letter with obvious reluctance. I don't know. But I'm afraid to find out. Open it, Jim said. I'll stay with you. She looked at him gratefully, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same rough handwriting as the address. Catherine read it silently, her face going pale. Then she handed it to Jim. The letter was brief and threatening. Catherine, Jake's dead and you got his share of the money from the last job. That's $5,000 that belongs to the gang. We need it for supplies and horses. Meet me in Socorro on June 15th at the cantina by the church. Bring the money or I'll come to Redemption Creek and take it. Don't think I won't find you. Lucas. Jim felt cold anger settle in his chest. So that was Lucas's game. He was trying to extort money from his dead brother's widow, and threatening her if she didn't comply. I don't have $5,000, Catherine said, her voice shaking. The money Jake supposedly had from their last robbery, I never saw it. Lucas must have it or one of the other gang members. I have about $300 to my name, money I saved from my sewing over the years. That's all. Lucas doesn't care about the truth, Jim said grimly. He just wants money and he figures you're an easy target. What do I do? Catherine looked at him with frightened eyes. If I don't go, he'll come here. He'll hurt people looking for me. But if I do go, he'll kill me when he realizes I don't have the money. Jim made a decision that would change both their lives. You don't do anything, he said firmly. I do. I'll handle Lucas Mercer. That evening, Jim sat in the sheriff's office with Tom Garrett, showing him the letter and explaining the situation. Billy Cooper leaned against the wall, listening intently, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt .45. This is bad, Garrett said, stroking his mustache. Lucas Mercer's got a reputation as a stone-cold killer. If he comes to Redemption Creek looking for that money, people could get hurt. Which is why we need to end this before he gets here, Jim said. I'm going to Socorro. Alone? Billy straightened up, his young face eager. I'll go with you, Jim. You'll need backup. Jim shook his head. This needs to be handled carefully. If Lucas sees two lawmen show up instead of his sister-in-law, he might rab it. Or he might start shooting. Either way, we lose our chance to take him peacefully. What are you proposing? Garrett asked. Jim laid out his plan. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was the best option he could think of. He would go to Socorro posing as a friend of Catherine's, delivering a message that she couldn't come but wanted to explain about the money. If he could get close to Lucas, get him talking, maybe he could take him without gunplay. And if Lucas was with his gang, Jim would assess the situation and decide whether to call for backup from the local law in Socorro. You're taking a hell of a chance, Garrett said. Lucas Mercer's smart. He might see through your cover. I know. But it's better than waiting for him to come here and put the whole town at risk. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. All right. But I want you to wire us when you get to Socorro, and again when you've made contact with Lucas. If I don't hear from you every day, I'm sending Billy and a posse. Fair enough. That night, Jim went to Catherine's house to tell her the plan. She opened the door holding a lamp, her hair down around her shoulders, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. Deputy? It's late. Is something wrong? Can I come in? She stepped aside and Jim entered, noting that she'd been sewing. A man's shirt lay across the table, pins marking alterations. I'm going to Socorro, Jim said without preamble. I'm going to meet Lucas in your place. Catherine's eyes went wide. No, absolutely not. He's dangerous, Jim. He's killed men. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something about hearing it from her lips made his chest tighten. I'm a lawman, Catherine. Dealing with dangerous men is what I do. But you don't have to do this. I can leave town, disappear again. Lucas will never find me. And spend the rest of your life running? Always looking over your shoulder, never able to settle down, never able to build the life you want. Jim shook his head. You deserve better than that. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. I'm not worth dying for, Jim. I'm just an outlaw's widow trying to survive. Jim stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. You're worth a lot more than you think, he said softly. And I'm not going to let Lucas Mercer hurt you. Not while I'm alive to prevent it. For a moment they just stood there looking at each other. Jim was acutely aware of how close they were, of the pull he felt toward her, the desire to touch her hand, to promise her that everything would be all right. But he was a lawman and she was complicated. So instead he stepped back, putting professional distance between them. I leave tomorrow, he said. The meeting's in 3 days. I'll wire Sheriff Garrett to let him know I've arrived safely. Please be careful, Catherine whispered. I've already lost one man I cared about. I couldn't bear to. She trailed off, but Jim heard what she hadn't said. She cared about him. Despite everything, the short time they'd known each other, the complications of their respective situations, she cared about him. I'll be careful, he promised. And when I come back we need to talk. About a lot of things. Catherine nodded, wiping at her eyes. When you come back. Socorro, New Mexico was a rough town even by frontier standards. It had grown up around silver mining operations, and it attracted the kind of people who were drawn to quick money and hard living. The cantina Lucas had mentioned in his letter was easy to find. A low adobe building near the old mission church, with a hitching post out front and the sound of guitars and laughter drifting through the open door. Jim had ridden hard for 2 days to get here and he was tired, dusty, and on edge. He'd wired Garrett as promised, letting him know he'd arrived safely. Now came the hard part, confronting an outlaw who had no reason to trust him and every reason to be trigger-happy. Jim had dressed carefully for this meeting. He'd left his badge back in Redemption Creek, not wanting to advertise his law enforcement status. Instead, he wore a simple shirt, vest, and trousers with his Colt .45 in a holster low on his hip. He looked like what he was pretending to be, a friend of Catherine's, someone who'd agreed to deliver a message. The sun was setting as Jim pushed through the cantina doors. The interior was dim and smoky, lit by oil lamps hanging from the ceiling. A handful of men sat at rough wooden tables, drinking mezcal and playing cards. A few local women served drinks, their colorful skirts swishing as they moved between tables. Jim spotted Lucas Mercer immediately. He was sitting alone at a corner table, his back to the wall, positioned where he could see both the front door and the back exit. He was younger than Jim had expected, probably in his late 20s, with the same dark hair and sharp features as his brother Jake, at least according to the wanted poster Jim had studied. But where Jake had apparently had some charm, Lucas looked hard and mean, with cold eyes that tracked Jim's every move as he crossed the room. Lucas Mercer? Jim asked, stopping a few feet from the table, hands visible, non-threatening. Lucas's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. Who's asking? Name's Jim. I'm a friend of Catherine's. She sent me to talk to you. Lucas's eyes narrowed. Catherine was supposed to come herself. Where is she? Can I sit? You can talk standing up just fine. Jim held his ground, not showing fear, not backing down. In his experience, outlaws respected strength, not submission. Catherine scared Lucas. She's scared you're going to hurt her. But she wanted me to tell you the truth about that money you think she has. The $5,000 from the Hayes City job. Jake's share. She doesn't have it, Jim said flatly. She never had it. Whatever happened to that money, she didn't see a cent of it. Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in it. You expect me to believe that? Jake always took care of Catherine. He would have given her his share. Maybe he would have if he'd survived. But he died in that robbery, Lucas. Catherine got a telegram and nothing else. She's been living on her sewing money, barely scraping by. She came to Redemption Creek to start over with $300 to her name. That's all she has. For a moment, Lucas looked uncertain. Then his face hardened. If she doesn't have the money, then someone does. And I'm going to find out who. Starting with you. Lucas's hand dropped to his gun, and Jim knew he had about 1 second to decide how this was going to play out. He could draw on Lucas, but there were other men in the cantina, and he didn't know if any of them were part of Lucas's gang. A gunfight here could turn into a massacre. So instead, Jim did something unexpected. He raised his hand slowly and said, I'm a Deputy Marshal Lucas. Deputy Jim Holloway out of Redemption Creek. And right now you've got a choice to make. The cantina went silent. Men at nearby tables froze, their hands moving toward weapons. Lucas's face flushed with anger. You son of a... Hear me out, Jim said sharply. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because Catherine asked me to help her, and because I don't want any shooting in my town or yours. You want that money? Fine. Let's talk about where it really went. Lucas stood slowly, his hand still on his gun. You got 30 seconds. Jim spoke quickly, laying out his theory. The Hayes City robbery had gone wrong, that much was known. Jake and another gang member had been killed, and the money had never been recovered by the law, which meant someone had taken it. Lucas and the surviving gang members had escaped, but without the money. So where had it gone? Think about it, Lucas. The law didn't get the money. You didn't get it. Jake died before he could run with his share. So who was in position to take it? Lucas's eyes flickered with understanding, then rage. Frank Dawson. That backstabbing. The other man who died? Jim guessed. No. Frank survived. He was the last one out of the bank. He said the law shot Jake and Tommy before they could grab the money bags, but... Lucas's face twisted with realization. He was lying. Frank took the money and ran. Probably figured we'd blame Jake's death, think the law got the cash. Jim could see Lucas's mind working, anger replacing confusion. This was good. If Lucas believed Catherine was innocent, he'd have no reason to go to Redemption Creek. But Jim needed to redirect that anger away from starting a new cycle of violence. Where's Frank Dawson now? Jim asked. Last I heard he was in Albuquerque. Running a saloon, if you can believe that. Went respectable with my money. Lucas finally took his hand off his gun. Why are you telling me this, Lawmen? You should be trying to arrest me. Because I'm more interested in keeping Catherine safe than I am in bringing you in, Jim said honestly. You go after Dawson, that's between you and him. But you leave Catherine alone. She's innocent in all this. She's just trying to build a decent life. Lucas studied Jim for a long moment. You sweet on my sister-in-law, deputy? Jim didn't answer, which was answer enough. Lucas laughed, and this time there was genuine amusement in it. Jake always said Catherine was too good for him. Looks like she's finally found someone more her type. All right, Lawmen. I'll leave Catherine be. But you tell her something for me. What's that? Tell her I'm sorry. Sorry for getting Jake into this life. Sorry for the years she spent waiting and worrying. Jake was my brother and I loved him, but I ruined his life. And hers. Lucas's voice went rough with emotion. She deserves to be happy. You make sure she gets that chance. Jim nodded slowly. I'll do my best. As Jim turned to leave, Lucas called out, Deputy? Watch your back in Albuquerque. Frank Dawson's got friends and he won't take kindly to being found. I'm not going to Albuquerque, Jim said. That's your business, not mine. I've got what I came for. But as Jim walked out of the cantina into the cool evening air, he had a feeling he hadn't seen the last of Lucas Mercer or the Hayes City money. Trouble had a way of following outlaws, and sometimes it caught innocent people in the crossfire. Jim spent one more night in Socorro, sleeping in a cheap hotel with his gun under his pillow and one eye open. Old habits from his years as a lawman. He wired Sheriff Garrett to let him know the meeting had gone well, that Lucas wouldn't be a threat to Catherine or the town. The ride back to Redemption Creek took 2 days, and Jim used the time to think. About Catherine, about the life she'd lived, about the future she was trying to build. And about his own feelings, which had grown more complicated with every passing day. He'd been a lawman for 12 years, ever since he'd left his family's farm in Missouri at age 20. He'd seen the worst of humanity, the greed, the violence, the casual cruelty that seemed to flourish on the frontier. He'd learned to keep his distance emotionally, to not get attached to people or places. It was safer that way, cleaner. But Catherine Mercer had gotten under his skin. Her quiet strength, her determination to start over despite the weight of her past, the sadness in her eyes that made him want to protect her, all of it pulled at something deep inside him that he'd thought long buried. Jim had been in love once before, years ago. Her name had been Mary, and she'd been the daughter of a shopkeeper in Dodge City. They'd talked about marriage, about building a life together. But then Jim had gone after a gang of horse thieves, and the pursuit had turned into a running gunfight across the Kansas plains. When he'd finally returned to Dodge City 2 weeks later, Mary had told him she couldn't live with the constant worry, the fear that every goodbye might be their last. She'd married a banker instead, a man who came home for dinner every night and never wore a gun. Jim had told himself he understood, that she'd made the right choice. But the rejection had stung, had confirmed what he'd already suspected, that a lawman's life was a lonely one. that asking someone to share was asking too much. And yet here he was, riding hard toward Redemption Creek and a woman who'd already buried one man who'd lived dangerously. Was he being selfish, letting himself care for her? Was he setting them both up for heartbreak? The sun was setting when Jim finally rode into Redemption Creek. The town looked peaceful, with lamplight glowing in windows and the sound of a piano drifting from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Home, Jim thought, and realized with some surprise that he meant it. After years of drifting from town to town, badge to badge, Redemption Creek had become home. Sheriff Garrett was waiting at the office, relief evident on his weathered face. Thank God. We were starting to worry when we didn't get a second telegram. Everything's fine, Jim said, dismounting and handing his horse's reins to Billy, who'd come running when he'd spotted Jim riding in. Lucas won't be coming to Redemption Creek. He's got other fish to fry. And Mrs. Mercer? She know you're back. Jim glanced down the street toward Catherine's small house. A lamp burned in the window, and he could see her silhouette moving inside. His heart did something complicated in his chest. Not yet. I need to clean up first, write my report. Tomorrow's soon enough. But Garrett was smiling knowingly. Son, you've been riding for 2 days. That report can wait. Go see the lady. Let her know she's safe. Jim wanted to protest, to maintain professional distance, but he couldn't. He was tired of lying to himself about what he felt. All right, he said. But Sheriff? This is complicated. Love usually is, Garrett said. But that doesn't make it any less worth pursuing. Catherine answered Jim's knock immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door. When she saw him standing there, dusty and tired but alive, her face went through a series of emotions, relief, joy, and something deeper that made Jim's breath catch. You're back, she said simply. I'm back. Come in. Please. Inside, Catherine's house smelled of coffee and fresh bread. She'd been baking, Jim realized, probably to keep her hands busy while she worried. The table was set with 2 cups, as if she'd known he'd come tonight. Tell me everything, Catherine said, pouring coffee with shaking hands. Jim told her about the meeting with Lucas, about the missing money and Frank Dawson, about Lucas's message of apology. Catherine listened in silence, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, tears sliding down her cheeks. He's not coming after me? She asked when Jim finished. No. He believes you don't have the money. And I think he genuinely regrets what happened to you and Jake. Not that regret changes anything. Catherine wiped at her eyes. No, it doesn't. But it's something. Jake used to talk about Lucas, about how close they were as boys. Lucas wasn't always bad. He made bad choices and they led to worse ones, and eventually he was in so deep he couldn't find his way out. That's the way it usually goes, Jim agreed. First crime is hard. Second's easier. By the 10th, you don't even think about it anymore. It becomes who you are. Is that what you think of me? Catherine asked quietly. That I'm defined by Jake's crimes? That I'll always be the outlaw's widow? Jim set down his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. I think you're the bravest woman I've ever met. I think you survived 8 years of hell, and instead of becoming bitter and hard, you stayed kind. I think you're trying to build something good out of the ashes of your old life. And I think... He paused, knowing that what he said next would change everything. I think I'm falling in love with you, Catherine Mercer. And I don't give a damn about your past or what people might say. I care about who you are now and who you're becoming. Catherine stared at him, her dark eyes wide with shock. Jim, you can't. I'm not asking for anything, Jim said quickly. I know this is complicated. I know you're still grieving Jake, still finding your footing. But I needed you to know how I feel. Because life's too short and too uncertain to keep important things unsaid. Catherine stood abruptly, moving to the window. She stood there for a long moment, her back to Jim, her shoulders rigid. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do this, Jim. Loving you, it's too soon. I'm too damaged. And you're a lawman, you wear a badge and carry a gun and risk your life. I've already buried one man. I don't think I could survive burying another. Jim stood and crossed to her, stopping just behind her. Close enough to touch but not touching. I can't promise I'll always come home safe. That's not a promise any lawman can make. But I can promise that I'll be careful. That I won't take stupid risks. And that every day I do come home, I'll be grateful for it. Catherine turned to face him, and in the lamplight, Jim could see the war being fought in her eyes. Fear versus hope, caution versus desire. What if I'm not strong enough? She whispered. Then I'll be strong enough for both of us, Jim said. Until you find your strength again. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his hand. Her skin was soft, warm, and she leaned into his touch like a flower seeking sunlight. "I don't need an answer tonight," Jim said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." But Catherine surprised him. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, a soft, tentative kiss that tasted of tears and coffee and hope. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "I think," she said softly, "that I'm falling in love with you too, Jim Holloway. And it terrifies me." "Then we'll be terrified together," Jim said, and kissed her again. The weeks that followed were the happiest Jim had ever known. He and Catherine began courting properly, or as properly as frontier conventions allowed. He'd take his dinner at her house several nights a week, and she'd bring lunch to him at the sheriff's office. They'd walk together on Sunday afternoons, talking about everything and nothing, slowly learning each other's stories, hopes, and dreams. The town noticed, of course. Redemption Creek was too small for anything to go unnoticed. There was talk, some of it kind, some of it less so. Mrs. Patterson thought it was romantic. Old man Henderson at the livery stable said Jim was a fool to get involved with an outlaw's widow. Reverend Taylor, the Methodist preacher, expressed concern about the propriety of their courtship. But Jim didn't care about the talk. For the first time in years he felt truly alive. Catherine had awakened something in him he thought dead, hope for a future beyond the badge, beyond the next gunfight or chase. She made him think about settling down, about building a real home, about children and growing old together. Catherine, for her part, seemed to blossom. The sadness that had haunted her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet joy. She laughed more easily, smiled more often. Her sewing business thrived, and she became a respected member of the community. The ladies who'd once whispered about her past now defended her against gossip. It was early July when everything changed again. Jim was making his morning rounds when a stranger rode into town. He was a big man, well-dressed in the style of a city dandy, with a pearl-handled revolver at his hip and cold eyes that swept the street like a hawk searching for prey. He stopped in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, tied his horse and went inside. Something about the man set Jim's instincts on edge. He followed, pushing through the saloon doors to find the stranger at the bar, ordering whiskey at 10 in the morning. "Morning," Jim said pleasantly but with steel underneath. "I'm Deputy Marshal Holloway. Don't think I've seen you in Redemption Creek before." The stranger turned, and Jim saw calculation in his eyes. This was a dangerous man, someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. "Name's Cole Brennan," the man said. "I'm a private detective out of Kansas City. Looking for someone." Jim's blood went cold. "That so? Who might that be?" "Woman named Catherine Mercer. Wife of an outlaw named Jake the Blade. Got reason to believe she might have information about money stolen from a bank in Hays City, Kansas. $5,000 that's owed to the bank's investors." "Mrs. Mercer's a respectable seamstress," Jim said carefully. "She's got nothing to do with her late husband's crimes." Cole Brennan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe so. But I've been hired to recover that money, and I intend to do my job. Now, you going to tell me where I can find Mrs. Mercer, or do I need to ask around town?" Jim's hand moved closer to his gun. "What I'm going to do is tell you that Mrs. Mercer is under the protection of this office. Any harassment of her will be treated as a crime. You want to ask her questions, you do it with me present. Clear?" Brennan's smile widened. "Crystal clear, Deputy. I'll be at the hotel when you arrange that interview." He tossed back his whiskey, dropped a coin on the bar, and walked out. Jim stood there, mind racing. He'd dealt with private detectives before. Some were honest men doing a job. Others were little better than bounty hunters, willing to bend the law to get results. He had a bad feeling about Cole Brennan. Jim found Catherine at her house, working on a wedding dress for one of the local rancher's daughters. When she saw his face, her needle stilled. "What's wrong?" "We've got trouble. There's a private detective in town looking for you. Says he's been hired to recover the money from the Hays City robbery." Catherine's face went pale. "But I don't have that money. We already know Lucas's partner took it." "I know that and you know that, but this detective doesn't care. He's being paid to recover $5,000, and I think he'll do whatever it takes to get it, including intimidating or even hurting you." Catherine set down her sewing with shaking hands. "What do we do?" "First, you're not going anywhere alone. I'll have Billy escort you if you need to go out. Second, I'm going to send a telegram to the marshal in Dodge City, see if we can get some information on Cole Brennan. And third." Jim hesitated, then continued, "I think it's time we track down Frank Dawson ourselves. If we can recover that money and return it, the detective will have no reason to bother you. But Dawson's dangerous. And he's in Albuquerque, that's days away. I can handle Dawson, Jim said with more confidence than he felt. The real question is whether you trust me to do this. Catherine stood and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. I trust you with my life, Jim Holloway. But I won't have you risking yours for me. There has to be another way. If there is, I haven't thought of it yet, Jim admitted. But I'll figure something out. I promise. That evening, Sheriff Garrett called Jim into his office. Billy was there too, looking nervous. On Garrett's desk was a telegram. This came in from Marshal Collins in Dodge City, Garrett said, handing it to Jim. It's about your private detective. Jim read the telegram and his jaw tightened with every word. Cole Brennan, stop, former lawman, stop, fired for excessive violence, stop, now works as private detective, stop, reputation for getting results by any means necessary, stop, be careful, stop. Damn, Jim muttered. There's more, Garrett said. Billy did some poking around. Turns out Brennan's not working for the bank at all. He's working for Frank Dawson. Jim's head snapped up. What? Billy nodded, looking pleased with himself for the good detective work. I got friendly with Brennan's horse handler at the livery. Kid said he heard Brennan talking to himself, practicing what he was going to say to Dawson when he got the money. Said Brennan's being paid $1,000 to recover the stolen cash and return it to Dawson. So Dawson's covering his tracks, Jim said slowly, his mind working through the implications. He stole the money from the gang, then hired a private detective to get it back from Catherine, who never had it in the first place. If Brennan can pin the theft on her, Dawson stays in the clear and he gets to keep the money. That's how I read it, Garrett agreed. Which means Catherine's in real danger. Brennan's going to push hard and he won't take, I don't have it, for an answer. Jim made a decision. I'm going to Albuquerque tonight. I'll find Dawson and make him call off his dog. That's a 3-day ride, Garrett protested. Brennan could move on Catherine before you get back. Then you and Billy keep him away from her. Lock him up if you have to, we'll figure out the charges later. Jim, Garrett said seriously, if you go after Dawson alone, you might not come back. He's got men, money, and no conscience. I'll be careful, Jim promised. But this ends now. Catherine suffered enough. Jim left Redemption Creek before dawn, riding hard toward Albuquerque. He'd said goodbye to Catherine the night before, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. Come back to me, she'd whispered. Always, he'd promised. Now, 3 days later, he sat in a dark corner of the Rio Grande saloon in Albuquerque, watching Frank Dawson hold court at a poker table. Dawson was a handsome man in his early 30s, well-dressed and smooth-talking, with a kind of easy charm that made people trust him. But Jim saw through it. He saw the calculation in Dawson's eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from his gun, the careful positioning that kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the exits. This was a man who'd betrayed his partners and let 2 of them die to cover his theft. He was dangerous precisely because he looked so harmless. Jim waited until the poker game broke up and Dawson headed toward the stairs that led to the rooms above the saloon. Then he made his move, following Dawson up the stairs and into the dimly lit hallway. Frank Dawson, Jim called out. Dawson spun, his hand going for his gun, but froze when he saw Jim's badge. Easy, Jim said, his own gun drawn and steady. I just want to talk. About what? Dawson's voice was smooth, unconcerned, but his eyes were wary. About $5,000 you stole from your partners in Hays City. About a private detective named Cole Brennan who's harassing an innocent woman on your behalf. About the lies you've been telling to cover up murder and theft. Dawson's face went carefully neutral. I don't know what you're talking about, deputy. I'm a legitimate businessman now. Own this saloon, in fact. Bought with stolen money, Jim said. Money that belongs to Lucas Mercer and the families of the men who died in that robbery. You got proof of that? Dawson asked, his tone challenging. I've got Lucas Mercer's testimony. And I've got telegrams from Dodge City about your past. That's enough to start an investigation, maybe bring in federal marshals. Could tie you up in courts for years, cost you this saloon and your freedom. Jim saw the calculation in Dawson's eyes. The outlaw-turned-businessman was weighing his options, trying to figure out his play. Or, Jim continued, you could wire your detective friend and tell him to leave Catherine Mercer alone. You could let this whole thing die quietly. I won't come after you for the robbery, that's not my jurisdiction. But you leave Catherine alone, or I make your life very difficult. That's it? Dawson asked. I call off Brennan and you walk away? That's it. Dawson was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. You're doing all this for Jake the Blade's widow? Must be some woman. She is, Jim said simply. All right, deputy. You got yourself a deal. I'll wire Brennan tonight, tell him the job's canceled. But you and I? We're even now. I don't want to see you again and you don't want to see me. Clear? Crystal clear. Jim holstered his gun and turned to leave. But Dawson's voice stopped him. Deputy? That woman better be worth it. You just let a thief and a killer walk free for her sake. That's going to sit heavy on your conscience. Jim looked back at Dawson. Maybe. But some things matter more than the badge. Took me a long time to learn that. The ride back to Redemption Creek felt longer than the ride out, even though Jim pushed his horse hard. He was eager to get home to see Catherine to tell her that the threat was over. But he was also bone-tired, worn down by days in the saddle and the weight of the choices he'd made. He'd let a criminal walk free. It went against everything he'd been taught as a lawman, everything he believed about justice and the law. But he'd done it to protect Catherine, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Maybe that made him a bad lawman. Or maybe it just made him human. It was late afternoon when Jim rode into Redemption Creek. The town looked the same as always, dusty, quiet, peaceful. But something felt different. There were more people on the street than usual, and they were all moving toward the sheriff's office. Jim's heart sank. Something had happened while he was gone. He dismounted and pushed through the crowd, his hand on his gun. Inside the office he found Sheriff Garrett, Billy Cooper and, to his shock, Lucas Mercer sitting calmly at the desk with his hands in clear view, no weapons. What the hell? Jim said. Jim? Catherine's voice came from the back room. She emerged looking worried but unharmed, and Jim felt his heart start beating again. Thank God you're back. Someone want to tell me what's going on? Lucas stood slowly, hands still visible. Easy, deputy. I'm here peacefully. Came to warn Catherine about Brennan. Figured she should know what kind of man was after her. Brennan's gone, Jim said. I took care of it. Not quite, Sheriff Garrett said grimly. Brennan didn't take Dawson's telegram kindly. He rode out of here yesterday in a fury, headed for Albuquerque. Said if Dawson was cutting him loose, he was going to get his money the old-fashioned way, by taking Dawson's saloon. Lucas grinned. Two snakes eating each other. Couldn't happen to nicer fellows. And you came all the way here just to warn Catherine? Jim asked skeptically. Lucas's expression turned serious. She's family. Jake's widow. That means something to me even if I am an outlaw. Besides, I owed her. For all the years of worry, for the life she could have had if Jake had never met me. He turned to Catherine. I'm riding out tonight. Heading to California, I think. Time to find a new line of work. But I wanted you to know, you're free of us, Catherine. Free of the Mercer name and all the trouble it brings. You got yourself a good man here in the deputy. Don't let him go. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Lucas. And, be careful. Always am, Lucas said with a wink. Then he looked at Jim. You take care of her, Lawmen. Or you'll answer to me. That's a promise, Jim said. After Lucas left, Sheriff Garrett wisely deciding to let him ride away rather than trying to arrest an outlaw who'd come in peace, Jim finally had a moment alone with Catherine. They stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sun set over Redemption Creek. So it's really over? Catherine asked softly. It's over, Jim confirmed. Brennan and Dawson will keep each other busy. Lucas is gone. You're safe. Catherine leaned against him, and Jim wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. I was so worried, she whispered. 3 days not knowing if you were alive or dead. I understand now what you meant about being strong enough for both of us. I think I found my strength, Jim. I think I can do this. Love you, even knowing the risks. Jim turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands. Catherine Mercer, I love you. I want to marry you, build a life with you, grow old with you. Will you take a chance on a broken-down deputy with too many scars and not enough sense? Catherine laughed through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. On one condition. What's that? That you promise me we'll have boring days. Lots of them. Days where nothing exciting happens, where we just sit on our porch and watch the sun set and be grateful for the peace. I can promise you that, Jim said. Though knowing our luck, something will probably catch fire or a gang of outlaws will ride through town. That's what I love about you, Catherine said, smiling. You know me too well already. They kissed as the sun painted the sky in brilliant reds and golds, and the people of Redemption Creek, who'd gathered to watch because that's what people in small towns do, broke into applause and cheers. 5 years later, Deputy Marshal James Holloway sat on the porch of his house, watching his 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, chase chickens in the yard. Catherine sat beside him, sewing a shirt for their son, Jake, named after her first husband, with Jim's blessing. It had seemed right, honoring the man who'd brought Catherine into the world, even if he'd done it through a difficult path. Jim had become sheriff 2 years ago when Tom Garrett retired. Billy Cooper was his deputy now, a solid lawman who'd learned his lessons well. Redemption Creek had grown, there was a railroad spur now and new businesses and families putting down roots. Catherine's sewing business had expanded into a full-dress shop, with 2 young women working for her. She was respected in the community, her past forgotten or forgiven by most folks. She was just Catherine Holloway now, the sheriff's wife, Sarah, and Jake's mother, a pillar of Redemption Creek society. Life hadn't been without its challenges. There'd been hard times. A drought one year, a bad winter the next, the occasional outlaw causing trouble. But they'd faced it all together, Jim and Catherine, building the quiet life they'd both dreamed of. Thinking about something? Catherine asked, setting down her sewing. Just thinking about how lucky I am, Jim said. 5 years ago, I was a deputy with no ties, no real home. Now look at me, wife, kids, a town that feels like family. The deputy who gave his heart to an outlaw's widow, Catherine said with a smile. That's what Mrs. Patterson calls our story. Says it's the most romantic thing she's ever heard. Romantic, crazy, dangerous, probably all 3, Jim agreed. But I wouldn't change a thing. Not even the part where you let Frank Dawson walk free? It was a question Catherine asked sometimes, when she worried that Jim regretted his choices. He always gave her the same answer. Not even that. Justice isn't always black and white, Catherine. Sometimes you have to choose between the law and what's right. I chose what was right and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. I love you, Jim Holloway. I love you too, Catherine Holloway. As the sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the desert in those same brilliant colors Jim remembered from that first evening 5 years ago, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. About the widow in black who'd stepped off a stagecoach and changed his life. About the choices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the love he'd found. The West was changing. The wild frontier days were fading, replaced by law, order, and civilization. But the legends remained, stories of outlaws and lawmen, of love and loss, of the brave men and women who'd shaped America's rugged past. And somewhere in those legends, Jim knew, there was a place for his story. The story of a deputy who'd given his heart to an outlaw's widow, and in doing so, had found his own redemption in a town called Redemption Creek.